The evening mist hung thick around Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old construction worker from Manchester, who had been drinking heavily at a nearby pub for the past 4 hours. His wife Sarah had left him earlier that week, taking their 2 children with her, and Marcus was drowning his sorrows in whiskey and beer. As Marcus stumbled closer to the palace gates, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the stoic figure of Guardsman James Mitchell, who stood perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat. The 22-year-old soldier had been serving with the Coldstream Guards for 2 years and took immense pride in his duty to protect the royal family. The afternoon crowd was unusually large, with families from around the world taking photographs and marveling at the precision of the guards. Children pointed excitedly at the soldiers while parents explained the centuries-old traditions they were witnessing. The atmosphere was peaceful and respectful, with most visitors maintaining an appropriate distance from the guards. Marcus, however, was not in a respectful mood. The alcohol had amplified his anger and resentment toward authority figures, a feeling that had been building since losing his job 3 months earlier. As he watched the motionless guard, something inside him snapped. He began muttering under his breath about fancy soldiers, playing dress-up and wasting taxpayer money. The other tourists started to notice Marcus's erratic behavior as he swayed on his feet and spoke loudly to himself. A few parents instinctively moved their children away from the increasingly agitated man. Security cameras positioned around the palace perimeter began tracking his movements as he stepped closer to the guard. Post-Guardsman Mitchell had been trained to ignore distractions and maintain his position regardless of what happened around him. He had dealt with tourists trying to make him laugh, children asking questions, and even the occasional person who got too close. But something about this particular visitor felt different. Through his peripheral vision, he could see the man approaching with unsteady steps and clenched fists. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus stopped just 5 feet away from the guard. His face was flushed red from alcohol and anger, and his clothes were disheveled from hours of drinking. The other tourists sensed something was about to happen and began backing away, though many kept their phones ready to record whatever unfolded. Marcus stared at the young soldier with growing irritation. The guard's perfect posture and unwavering discipline reminded him of everything he felt he had lost in his own life. His marriage, his job, his self-respect, all seemed to pale in comparison to the honor and stability that this young man represented. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus began shouting questions at the guard, demanding responses that he knew would never come. His voice grew louder and more aggressive with each ignored query, and the crowd around them grew increasingly uncomfortable. Some tourists began leaving the area entirely, while others pulled out their phones to document what they sensed was about to become a serious incident. What started as drunken rambling was quickly escalating into something far more dangerous, and neither Marcus nor the watching crowd realized just how far this confrontation was about to go. Marcus's verbal assault on Guardsman Mitchell intensified as his patience wore thin. "Answer me when I'm talking to you," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. The smell of alcohol was so strong that even tourists standing 10 feet away could detect it. His hands shook with rage as he pointed aggressively at the motionless soldier. The guard remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as he had been trained to do. Years of discipline and military conditioning allowed him to maintain his composure, even as Marcus's shouts grew more personal and insulting. The young soldier's heart rate increased slightly, but his breathing remained controlled and steady. A small crowd of about 30 tourists had now formed a semicircle around the unfolding drama. Most held their smartphones aloft, recording every moment of the confrontation. Among them was Elena Rodriguez, a travel blogger from Spain who was live-streaming the incident to her followers. The view count on her stream was climbing rapidly as word spread across social media platforms. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Marcus bellowed, his face now inches away from the guard's chin strap. "Standing there in your fancy costume while real men like me lose everything." His voice cracked with emotion as deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and failure poured out in a torrent of alcohol-fueled rage. Detective Sergeant Williams, who was on plainclothes security duty near the palace, had been monitoring the situation from a distance. She spoke quietly into her radio, alerting other officers to the developing incident while carefully positioning herself for a potential intervention. Her training told her that drunk individuals near high security Locations required immediate attention. The situation took a darker turn when Marcus began making threats about what he would do if the guard continued to ignore him. His language became increasingly violent and disturbing, causing several families to quickly escort their children away from the area. The festive atmosphere that usually surrounded the palace had been completely replaced by tension and fear. Guardsman Mitchell's superior officers were now aware of the situation through their communication system. They had protocols for dealing with aggressive individuals, but removing a guard from his post was not a decision made lightly. The young soldier received a subtle signal through his earpiece to maintain his position while backup security moved into place. Marcus's behavior became more erratic as he began pacing back and forth in front of the guard post. He would approach within inches of the soldier, then back away while continuing his verbal abuse. His movements were becoming increasingly unpredictable, and the security personnel watching through cameras grew more concerned about what he might do next. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 50 people, with more arriving as social media posts about the incident spread online. Some tourists were treating it like entertainment, laughing and commenting on Marcus's behavior, which only seemed to fuel his anger further. He began directing his rage toward the crowd as well, shouting at them to stop filming and mind their own business. What nobody realized was that Marcus had a history of violent behavior when intoxicated. 3 years earlier, he had been arrested for assaulting a police officer during a similar drunken episode. The charges had eventually been dropped, but the incident had cost him his previous job and contributed to the deterioration of his marriage. As Marcus's outburst continued, the professional composure of Guardsman Mitchell began to show the first subtle signs of strain, and the watching security officers prepared themselves for the possibility that this confrontation was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The confrontation reached a critical point when Marcus made his first physical contact with Guardsman Mitchell. With a sudden, aggressive movement, he shoved the soldier's shoulder hard enough to make him take a small step backward. The crowd gasped collectively, realizing they had just witnessed a serious escalation that would have immediate consequences. Guardsman Mitchell's training kicked in automatically. According to regulations, any physical assault on a member of the Royal Guard was to be met with appropriate force. However, the young soldier also had to consider the presence of numerous civilians in the immediate area. His hand moved subtly toward his weapon as he assessed the threat level, while maintaining his disciplined stance. Detective Sergeant Williams immediately began moving through the crowd, speaking urgently into her radio to request immediate backup. She could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, and that Marcus's behavior was becoming increasingly dangerous. Her years of experience dealing with intoxicated individuals told her that violence was now almost inevitable. Marcus seemed emboldened by the guard's slight movement, interpreting it as a sign of weakness rather than restraint. "Finally got a reaction out of you," he shouted triumphantly, his confidence boosted by what he perceived as a victory. This encouragement led him to become even more aggressive, and he began making gestures as if he might strike the soldier. Again, the crowd's mood shifted dramatically, from curiosity to genuine fear as they realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a drunk tourist making a scene. Several people began backing away more quickly, while others remained transfixed by the unfolding drama. The livestream viewers watching Elena's broadcast had increased to over 2,000 people, with comments flooding in from around the world. Palace security officers in the control room were now tracking multiple camera angles of the incident while coordinating the response. They had identified Marcus through facial recognition software and were pulling up his background information, including his previous arrest record. This intelligence would be crucial for the officers preparing to intervene. Guardsman Mitchell received another communication through his earpiece, this time authorizing him to take defensive action if physically threatened again. The young soldier's pulse quickened slightly, but his training helped him maintain the calm exterior that was essential to his role. He knew that millions of people around the world saw the Royal Guards as symbols of British discipline and professionalism. Marcus's next move was to start walking in circles around the guard post, continuing his verbal abuse while occasionally making threatening gestures. His coordination was clearly impaired by alcohol, and he stumbled several times, which seemed to anger him even more. The unpredictability of his movements made it difficult for security personnel to anticipate his next action. The situation became more complicated when Marcus began trying to engage the crowd in his confrontation. He turned to the tourists and began shouting about how the guards were a waste of money and that people should demand answers from them. Most of the crowd ignored his attempts to involve them, but a few individuals seemed amused by his antics, which encouraged him to continue. Elena's live stream had caught the attention of major news outlets, and several journalists were now en route to the palace. The incident was beginning to trend on social media platforms, with hashtags related to the confrontation spreading rapidly. What had started as a personal breakdown was quickly becoming a public spectacle with international attention. As Marcus prepared to make another aggressive move toward the guard, Detective Sergeant Williams positioned herself strategically behind him, while uniformed officers approached from multiple directions. The next few moments would determine whether this confrontation could be resolved peacefully or whether it would escalate into a violent altercation that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The tension in the air was now so thick that even tourists who had just arrived could immediately sense that something dangerous was about to happen. Without warning, Marcus lunged forward and grabbed Guardsman Mitchell's rifle with both hands, attempting to wrestle it away from the soldier. The crowd erupted in screams and shouts as people began running in all directions, abandoning their phones and belongings in their panic to escape what had suddenly become a dangerous situation. Guardsman Mitchell's response was immediate and professional. Using his military training, he maintained his grip on the weapon while simultaneously calling out the traditional warning, "Stand back from the Queen's Guard." His voice cut through the chaos with authority that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training. The young soldier's muscles tensed as he prepared to defend both himself and his weapon. Detective Sergeant Williams rushed forward, but the crowd's panicked movement made it difficult for her to reach Marcus quickly. She shouted commands at the fleeing tourists to clear the area while simultaneously calling for immediate armed response units. Her heart pounded as she realized that a struggle over a loaded military weapon in a crowded public space was every security officer's worst nightmare. The physical confrontation between Marcus and the guard was brief but intense. Despite being impaired by alcohol, Marcus's desperation gave him surprising strength as he tried to wrench the rifle away. However, Guardsman Mitchell's superior training and sobriety quickly gave him the advantage. With a swift, controlled movement, he broke Marcus's grip and pushed him backward. Marcus stumbled and fell heavily onto the pavement, scraping his hands and tearing his jacket. The fall seemed to momentarily sober him as the reality of what he had just attempted began to sink in. He looked up at the guard with a mixture of fear and confusion, as if seeing the soldier clearly for the first time. The magnitude of his action started to penetrate through the alcohol-induced fog in his mind. Elena, the travel blogger, had continued filming throughout the chaos, capturing the entire assault on her livestream. Her viewer count had now exceeded 5,000 people, with viewers from around the world watching the dramatic confrontation unfold in real time. The comment section was exploding with reactions ranging from shock to outrage to calls for Marcus's immediate arrest. Armed police officers arrived on the scene within 90 seconds of the assault, their weapons drawn and voices commanding Marcus to remain on the ground. The sight of multiple officers with firearms finally seemed to break through Marcus's alcohol-induced bravado, and he began to realize the serious legal trouble he was now facing. His hands shook as he raised them above his head in surrender. Guardsman Mitchell, despite having just been physically assaulted, maintained his composure and returned to his post. However, his superiors quickly made the decision to replace him with a fresh guard while he was debriefed about the incident. As he was escorted away for medical evaluation and questioning, the young soldier couldn't help but replay the confrontation in his mind. The area around the palace was quickly secured by additional security personnel, while bomb disposal experts were called in to examine Marcus's belongings as a precaution. Standard protocol required a thorough investigation whenever someone attempted to take a weapon from a guard, as it could potentially be part of a larger terrorist plot. Marcus was handcuffed and placed under arrest while paramedics checked him for injuries from his fall. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the full weight of his actions seemed to hit him all at once. Tears began streaming down his face as he realized that his moment of drunken rage had likely destroyed any chance he had of reconciling with his wife and children. The crowd that had fled during the confrontation slowly began to return, drawn by curiosity and the desire to witness the aftermath of the dramatic incident. Police officers worked to establish a perimeter while investigators began collecting evidence and identifying witnesses who could provide statements about what they had observed. Social media platforms were now buzzing with videos and commentary about the incident, with news outlets picking up the story and beginning to investigate Marcus's background and motivations for the assault. As Marcus was loaded into the police van, news crews began arriving at Buckingham Palace. The incident had already made international headlines, with footage from Elena's live stream being broadcast on major networks around the world. The attempted weapon grab had transformed what started as a drunk man's outburst into a serious security incident that would have far-reaching consequences. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins took charge of the investigation, immediately ordering a comprehensive review of all security footage from the palace's extensive camera network. She knew that this case would be scrutinized at the highest levels of government, as any attempt to disarm a royal guard was considered a potential terrorist act until proven otherwise. The pressure to conduct a thorough investigation was immense. At the police station, Marcus was placed in a holding cell where the effects of alcohol began to wear off. As his head cleared, the magnitude of what he had done became increasingly apparent. He had not only assaulted a member of the royal guard, but had attempted to take his weapon in front of dozens of witnesses and thousands of online viewers. His legal situation was extremely serious. Meanwhile, Guardsman Mitchell was undergoing a detailed debriefing with military officials and palace security. Despite handling the situation with textbook precision, he would still need to complete extensive paperwork and undergo counseling to ensure he was mentally prepared to return to duty. The young soldier was praised for his restraint and professionalism under extreme pressure. The story dominated social media throughout the evening, with such a drunk Viesgard trending worldwide. The incident sparked heated debates about palace security, the behavior of tourists, and the pressures facing ordinary citizens during economic hardship. Some people expressed sympathy for Marcus's personal struggles, while others condemned his actions as inexcusable and dangerous. Sarah Thompson, Marcus's estranged wife, first learned about the incident when friends began sending her links to news articles featuring her husband's photograph. The humiliation and shock of seeing Marcus's breakdown broadcast around the world was devastating. She had left him because of his drinking and anger issues, and now the entire world was witnessing exactly why their marriage had failed. Legal experts appeared on news programs throughout the evening, explaining the serious charges Marcus would likely face. Attempting to disarm a guard could result in charges ranging from assault on a police officer to attempted theft of government property. Some speculated that terrorism charges might even be considered given the high-security nature of the location. The incident prompted an immediate review of security protocols at all royal residences. Palace officials met with police commanders to discuss whether additional barriers or personnel were needed to prevent similar confrontations. The fact that an intoxicated individual had been able to get close enough to physically assault a guard raised serious questions about current security measures. Elena Rodriguez found herself at the center of the media storm as news outlets sought to license her footage of the confrontation. Her live stream had provided the most complete documentation of the incident, making her an important witness in the criminal case that would follow. The unexpected attention transformed her from a travel blogger into a key figure in an international news story. Marcus's employer, a construction company in Manchester, issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions and confirming that he had been terminated months earlier due to poor performance and attendance issues related to his drinking. Former colleagues described him as a man who had been struggling with personal problems but had never shown signs of violence toward authority figures. As night fell over London, the investigation continued with officers working to piece together Marcus's movements leading up to the confrontation. They visited the pub where he had been drinking, interviewed the staff who had served him, and began building a timeline of events that had led to his decision to target the Royal Guard. The incident had already changed both men's lives forever. Marcus faced the possibility of years in prison, while Guardsman Mitchell would forever be remembered as the soldier who maintained his composure during one of the most dramatic confrontations in recent Royal Guard history. Neither man could have imagined how a few minutes of chaos would impact so many lives around the world. 3 days after the incident, Marcus appeared in Westminster Magistrates' Court for his first hearing. The courtroom was packed with journalists and members of the public who had followed the story. He looked dramatically different from the angry, intoxicated man who had confronted the guard. Clean-shaven and wearing a borrowed suit, Marcus appeared fragile and remorseful as he stood before the judge. The charges against him were severe: assault on a police officer, attempting to steal government property, and public disorder. His court-appointed lawyer, David Harrison, had reviewed the extensive video evidence and advised Marcus that his best option was to plead guilty and hope for leniency. The evidence was overwhelming, with dozens of witnesses and multiple camera angles capturing every moment of the confrontation. Detective Inspector Collins presented the case to the court, describing how Marcus's actions had endangered public safety and violated the security of a major royal residence. She emphasized that only the professional restraint of Guardsman Mitchell had prevented the situation from becoming a tragedy. The prosecution argued for a custodial sentence given the serious nature of the offenses. Marcus's wife Sarah sat in the public gallery, tears streaming down her face as she watched her husband face the consequences of his actions. Despite their separation, she still cared about him and understood that his behavior stemmed from deep-seated problems with alcohol and depression. She had prepared a statement for the court describing his struggles and asking for compassion. The defense presented evidence of Marcus's personal difficulties, including the loss of his job, the breakdown of his marriage, and his battle with alcoholism. Character witnesses testified about his previous good nature before his problems with drinking began. His former supervisor described him as a reliable worker, whose performance had deteriorated only after his personal life fell apart. Guardsman Mitchell, now back on duty, had provided a victim impact statement describing how the incident had affected him. While he praised his training for helping him handle the situation, he admitted that the confrontation had been traumatic and that he continued to feel anxious about similar incidents occurring in the future. His statement was read to the court by the prosecutor. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about mental health and addiction in British society. Support groups for alcoholics reported increased calls for help from people who identified with Marcus's situation. The dramatic footage of his breakdown had served as a wake-up call for many. Individuals struggling with similar problems. Elena Rodriguez had become an unexpected advocate for both men involved in the confrontation. In interviews with news outlets, she expressed sympathy for Marcus while praising the guard's professionalism. She used her platform to raise awareness about alcoholism and to start a crowdfunding campaign to help Marcus get treatment if he avoided prison. The international attention had put pressure on the justice system to handle the case fairly, while sending a clear message about the consequences of threatening royal security. Legal experts noted that the case had become a test of how British courts balance compassion for individuals with serious personal problems against the need to protect important national institutions. Palace officials had implemented new security measures in response to the incident, including additional barriers around guard posts and increased surveillance. However, they were careful to maintain the traditional accessibility that allowed tourists to observe the changing of the guard ceremony. The balance between security and tradition was delicate. Marcus's children, aged 8 and 10, had been shielded from most of the media coverage by their mother, but they were aware that their father was in serious trouble. Sarah struggled with whether to bring them to court to see him, knowing that the image of their father in handcuffs might traumatize them further. As the judge prepared to deliver his decision, Marcus stood with his head bowed, fully aware that his moment of drunken rage had not only destroyed his own life, but had caused pain to everyone who cared about him. The packed courtroom waited in silence to learn whether he would be going to prison or given a chance at redemption. The case had become more than just a legal proceeding. It had evolved into a human story about the consequences of untreated addiction and the importance of seeking help before reaching a breaking point. Judge Margaret Fleming delivered her sentence with careful consideration for both the severity of Marcus's actions and the personal circumstances that had led to them. She sentenced him to 18 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, contingent on his completion of an intensive alcohol rehabilitation program and 300 hours of community service. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions as people processed the decision. Marcus collapsed in relief when he realized he wouldn't be going to prison immediately. His wife Sarah sobbed openly in the gallery, grateful that their children wouldn't have to visit their father in jail. However, the judge made it clear that any violation of the terms of his suspended sentence would result in immediate imprisonment. Marcus would be on probation for the next 2 years with regular check-ins and mandatory sobriety testing. The rehabilitation program Marcus was required to attend was intensive and demanding. For 6 months, he would participate in daily group therapy sessions, individual counseling, and educational programs about addiction. The program had a success rate of about 60%, but it required complete commitment from participants. Marcus understood that this was his last chance to turn his life around. Guardsman Mitchell was privately relieved by the sentence. Feeling that justice had been served while still allowing Marcus a chance at redemption, the young soldier had been promoted to Lance Corporal, partly in recognition of his exemplary handling of the incident. He continued to serve at Buckingham Palace, though he admitted that he remained more alert to potential threats than he had been before the confrontation. The incident had lasting effects on palace security protocols. New barriers were installed to create a larger buffer zone between guards and tourists, while additional plainclothes security officers were deployed during peak visiting hours. The changes were implemented carefully to preserve the traditional pageantry that drew millions of visitors to London each year. Elena Rodriguez used the attention from her viral live stream to launch a documentary project about the incident and its aftermath. She followed both Marcus and Guardsman Mitchell through their recovery and adjustment processes, creating a powerful story about redemption, forgiveness, and the impact of mental health issues on ordinary people. The documentary was later nominated for several awards. Marcus's recovery journey was difficult but ultimately successful. The structured environment of the rehabilitation program helped him understand the root causes of his drinking and develop healthy coping mechanisms for stress and depression. He began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings regularly and found support from others who had faced similar struggles with addiction and loss. 6 months after completing his rehabilitation program, Marcus was reunited with his children for supervised visits. Sarah, while not ready to reconcile their marriage, recognized the genuine changes in her husband and slowly began allowing more contact between him and their children. The road to rebuilding trust would be long, but Marcus was committed to proving he had changed. The community service portion of Marcus's sentence involved working with homeless individuals and people struggling with addiction. He found purpose in helping others who faced similar challenges to those he had overcome. His experience became a powerful tool for reaching people who might otherwise resist getting help for their problems. Guardsman Mitchell was eventually transferred to a different posting at his own request, seeking a fresh start away from the constant reminders of the incident. He remained in the military and was considered for officer training, having demonstrated exceptional judgment and restraint under extreme pressure. The confrontation, while traumatic, had ultimately enhanced his reputation within the service. The story became a case study in criminal justice programs, highlighting the effectiveness of rehabilitation-focused sentencing for nonviolent offenders struggling with addiction. Legal experts noted that Marcus's successful completion of his sentence demonstrated the value of addressing underlying causes of criminal behavior rather than simply punishing the symptoms. 2 years later, Marcus had maintained his sobriety, completed his community service, and begun rebuilding relationships with his family. He had found steady employment with a construction company that specialized in hiring people with criminal backgrounds who were working to turn their lives around. While he could never undo the embarrassment and consequences of that day at Buckingham Palace, he had transformed his lowest moment into the foundation for a better life. The confrontation that had lasted only minutes had changed multiple lives forever, serving as a powerful reminder of how quickly poor decisions can spiral out of control and how dedication to recovery can lead to redemption even after the most public of failures.